Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Small Soldiers from 1998. And this is a winner of the Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below and pledge, and maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. And this movie was selected by Ryan Walterson. Of course. What I find interesting about how I came to see this movie is I'd never seen it before making this review. I think I missed it at the time. I feel like we were on a vacation or something, and I didn't see it. The only thing I really remember about Small Soldiers is a lot of people said, "Oh, this is like they're trying to rip off Toy Story." I remember people saying that. I haven't found much actual info of anyone thinking that at the time. There's a couple of movies actually I've thought of recently, and I was like, why did I think that? And I think somebody or a few people or something just said it to me and it's stuck in my brain. I don't think this is like a ripoff or like a live action version. I think most likely the script was around. Joe Dante pitched it, or whomever had the script, which was Ted Elliott, Terry Russo, Adam Rifkin, and Gavin Scott. Oh, some pretty big people there. But I'm sure they had the idea or something, maybe after seeing Toy Story. But it's sort of like, I wouldn't say this is like how there were, after there was Star Wars, there were various like Star Wars ripoffs, Saturn 7, stuff like Black Hole. And yeah, those were, but then you get things like Alien. Now, Alien was probably given more promotion and maybe greenlit and given some more post money or something because of the success of Star Wars, but I would never call Alien a ripoff of Star Wars. I think the same is sort of true with Small Soldiers. I definitely think they thought, hey, Toy Story worked, but I also think they probably thought, well, Jingle All the Way worked and Jumanji worked, and family films are up right now, and we're thinking about you had the 101 Dalmatians live action thing and Flubber. Like, this is more in line with that, which I think is the best way to put it, and I think that shows the difference in this film as well, because Joe Dante directed Gremlins, and directed actual horror movies and stuff. It does feel like his 90s output gets a little lost, although I'm a huge fan of Matinee, especially as a kid. I really liked that movie a lot as a kid. He's not really as prevalent. I mean, this is only his last movie in theaters. Before this was Matinee in 1993. He did do 3 TV movies in between those. And then that was it. He only made 3 films in the 90s, Gremlins 2 in 1990, Matinee, and then this for the theaters, which is kind of crazy considering how big his 80s was. It just feels more like a Joe Dante directed film filtered through a family film at the time. It's not as violent as Gremlins. Apparently he did want to do more violence, but brands got involved and all this stuff, and as the corporate wheel started moving, and so they couldn't make the original kind of film. You can see Gremlins elements. Again, this film is sort of its own original thing. I should probably explain the plot at this point, but it's its own original thing. It's not just like a ripoff of anything. I can tell auteurish elements that you can connect to him from Gremlins and so forth, but for the most part, it's sort of its own thing. So a toy company is bought by a huge weapons manufacturer. They asked them to make toys, and they said you can have access to any chips you want. They put evil kind of weapon computer chips into the toys, and they become alive and can learn and can do damage. They're supposed to go out, but this one kid whose dad runs a toy store that only has educational things, which is called Inner Child, which that's pretty hilarious. But his son gets these war toys, basically takes them off the truck, and is going to try to sell them while his dad is away on some business trip or something. That's not important, but basically he gets them a little early before a street date, and they start to come alive, and so he has to fight them off. And while all the other toys have been recalled all over the nation, he has these crazy toys that are going around running amok and doing all these things. There are 2 sides: a good guys team, which are kind of like soldiers, and then the Gorgonauts, which were the original plan and kind of the more traditional action figure thing, and both of them fight each other just because they do. And this boy, played by Gregory Smith, had to stop them with the help of Kirsten Dunst and their parents and all that stuff. It doesn't get too violent or scary or anything like that. It's almost sort of surprising a horror director made this, to be honest with you. It doesn't feel as Joe Dante meta as I'd say back in action did. I think Back in Action is the more insane, Looney Tunes Back in Action is what I mean, insane version of this. This is a little more tempered down as like him playing nice for the studio or something, but I still think it's very much him. He has, you know, this crazy like creepy version of like basically the idea of war toys. You know, you had in the 80s and 90s a thing with war toys where like, you know, they didn't want boys to play with like fake guns. That's why there's like an orange little nozzle thing on play guns, because they didn't want people to think they were real guns because kids were shot and stuff like that. So so the idea of taking that and like that these toys are like G.I. Joes or something are war toys and making them actually powered by computer chips from a weapons manufacturer and they will actually go to war is an interesting, a very interesting idea. And I like that Ted Elliott and Terry Russo, it is an amazing idea. It's a really cool idea of taking that to its logical kind of extreme. I would say a lot of the technology is, in some ways, I guess in the 90s it felt more advanced. I think it's kind of shot in a very like 90s kind of style, like very late 90s kind of kids movie style. Like it's very bright and, you know, sort of almost like what Marvel movies would do, but it looks way worse somehow. And I don't love that aesthetic to it, but I do like the kind of heart and the idea of these toys coming to life and these kids doing this thing and stuff like that. And the Gorgonauts are voiced by Frank Langella in Spinal Tap, pretty much, which I think is great, as well as other people. And then the bad guys are voiced by Tommy Lee Jones, or the military people, Tommy Lee Jones, and people from the original Dirty Dozen film like Jim Brown and stuff like that. So, which is a cool mixture of stuff. I don't remember anyone making a big deal about those voice casting, but when I watch them now, I'm like, oh, you can tell they had like really good talents behind, and they should have brought up. And Sarah Michelle Gellar and Christina Ricci play the dolls, which also would have been a big deal at the time. I like a lot of the performances, particularly Phil Hartman, who this is his last on-screen role because he was killed 2 months before. It's not as good as like something he did in like Jingle All the Way or something like that. This is an early kind of role for David Cross doing kind of a kids film. I think he'd done Men in Black the previous year, but this time when you'd see him in something you're like, oh, from Mr. Show and stuff. Now I guess it's like Arrested Development and all that, but it's kind of his first what I call more of a kids film. I like him in this. It kind of reminds me of seeing him in stuff and go, oh, Mr. Show, you know, even though that's not the thing. And Dennis Leary basically does his old Dennis Leary shtick that he used to do on MTV, which is like moderately fine and very 90s, and the parents are alright. I think this is a decent kids film, but and a decent kind of family movie, but I can't help to think within Joe Dante's filmography, he has some like real all-time classics in there, and I just don't see Small Soldiers as that necessarily. I think it is fun. I think it says a lot about toys and commercialism and how we sell war to children and sell the military to children and the general public, how there's an inherent evil in that, and like these crazy, you know, insane creatures or the thing that we're afraid of are usually the thing that's better for us and things like that. But what I think works with Joe Dante is he definitely gets that idea of like a kid playing and getting into a big kind of huge adventure, which was very clear in something like Gremlins, but also is very clear and really great here. If you're into the kind of idea of this kind of toy thing, I think I would recommend Small Soldiers, but it's not the film you're going to remember Joe Dante for, which I think is a fair thing to say. But I think it is, you know, kind of like the top of the second tier pretty much, because it doesn't pop out necessarily. There's not, it feels different and more raw and more kind of stranger and weirder than you get from a Flubber and everything like that at the time. It feels like somebody weird is in charge, definitely, but it doesn't feel like they totally surrendered to it. You know, this Small Soldiers probably would be better in the 80s, like the idea of it with like natural effects and stuff, than it is in the 90s. I think Small Soldiers, you know, it played pretty well at the time. It didn't, you know, take over or anything like that. It was sort of like Joe Dante's last hurrah. He didn't really have any, this is his last kind of film that made any sort of money, unfortunately, because of Back in Action after this. And it's kind of a weird career point for a lot of them. It is nice seeing Kirsten Dunst and Phil Hartman, you know, reunited, that Kiki dub reunited. I'm sure they talked about it the entire time they were there. This works into, you know, it's got home invasion, it's got, you know, toys that come alive. What more do you want? That's like all your favorite 90s movies. altogether. And in that, like, it definitely works for what it is. I just like don't think I think back on it the way I think of his other films. I don't think it goes into as many interesting, cynical, weird ideas as he's really great with. I think that's sort of a missed opportunity here. I feel like in my head, Joe Dante makes this a better movie, but the actual execution, I have to say, is like sort of typical for the time period, but a little more inspired than it has any real right to be. But it is an interesting idea. What would happen if toys came to life, run by corporations? What good would they do? What evil would they do? Or would they just hide or whatever? It kind of sings in a way. It is definitely very watchable. And I like that it's like being critical of both the media and the toys that our children consume, and like what that will inevitably do to us and so forth. I think is a really interesting question to ask. I just don't know if asking that question was executed in the best way. When I look at this film, I think, it's got the Dick Smith things and all that stuff, and Jay Moore, and like a crazy good cast. They clearly believed in this thing, but it feels like if they just left him alone with no notes, we probably would have gotten a much more weirder, interesting film that you can really sink your teeth into. And they almost like didn't want to let Small Soldiers and thought it would work out, and I guess it sort of did. Part of me feels like if they ever do remake it, I know they talked about it, then they should go into deep into the more interesting, weirder, darker, more bloodier cut of Small Soldiers, or version or idea of Small Soldiers, because that, I think, is where this really could live, because the kind of normal kids aren't going to see this film, like might as well go into the weird horror gore or the idea of Small Soldiers. Instead, you get a pretty decent sanitized kids film from the 90s, but not one that's necessarily overly remarkable or anything like that. I think you would probably walk away from it thinking of it as sort of just maybe a lesser Joe Dante, but one you can definitely have fun with. So if you've seen Small Soldiers and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.